Last part, my name is leads to graveyard shift. It's a friend of mine. That's the intent. About cultural awareness.
Thanks, Nigel. It's the first time I've ever had the graveyard shift at a conference, so new experience for me. So I'm talking about some very, very early work. In fact, the results are kind of more in my head than on the slides. I'm really interested in your thoughts on what I'm trying to do here. So I work in a central role at the University of Derby. So I do a limited amount of teaching. And one of my kind of key responsibilities is working on our attainment policy. And I'm particularly interested in racial equity. And I do a lot of work going around colleges, schools, discipline teams, talking about the institutional strategy and trying to help them tackle their own awarding gaps. And one of the most frequent questions that I get is, great, I'm here, I'm on board, but what can I actually do? Now, I've got loads of examples from the literature, but what I never had was any examples from my own experience, which for me is really important to be authentic. So this is what this is about. So I've put a cultural awareness program in an undergraduate bioscience module. It's a module called Science Communication. It's the only module I teach and lead now. So first of all, and I've done something I've never done before, which I should acknowledge. Obviously, white, heterosexual, middle class male. On any privilege score, I've got all of them, literally everything. And to show my own insecurities, something I don't think I've ever done. I've got a few notes here about the wordage, some of the terms in here, which says something in its own right, I think. So culturally sensitive curriculum. So first of all, what do I mean by cultural? So I've actually written the words on the slide here. Awareness and understanding of cultural differences that exist between people without assigning them value. So this doesn't mean just saying that one is better than the other, which I think is fairly obvious that is something that we shouldn't be doing, but also moving away from the we to them. The way we do it here implies some kind of binary value. So that's what culture means in the context of culturally sensitive curriculum. In terms of culturally sensitive curriculum, to me, it means looking at your theories in your class, something I think we're quite familiar with, your general attitude that you have in the teaching environment, but also your teaching methods. So those kind of three things. And then making sure that you reference, you respect people, you recognise and acknowledge students' different cultural contexts in all of those things. It's a real big ask, it's a real big thing to try and get your head round. And if you'd have asked me before I start this piece of work, do I do that? I probably would have said, on a scale of people who do lots and people who don't lot, I'll be up here somewhere. I was not. The drivers of these three pieces of research here, Dave Thomas, just about to join university, Solent University, and Kathleen Quinlan from the University of Kent. They developed the culturally sensitive curriculum scale. It's worth just saying a word about them because it does set the scene for what I'm going to talk about. So their early work, 2016, was looking at what they call the talk curriculum. So effectively reading lists, materials presented to students like slides, and looking for cultural awareness in them. And that led them to develop the culturally sensitive curriculum scale, which is the final reference on there, which was trying to assess the perceived curriculum. Dear students, what do you think about the cultural values that are embedded in your curriculum? So actually asking them. And their biggest study took 262 students, of which 157 were from BME backgrounds, that's their term, and asked them how culturally aware they thought their curriculum was on 4 different dimensions, and I'll show you those in a minute, mapped against their interest, or AKA engagement in the curriculum. Shock horror, newsflash, BME students did worse in all 4 scales compared to white students. But what was really interesting in their work, they found 2 of these scales actually, an aggression analysis negates the negative effect that ethnicity has on engagement. Or in other words, if you sort these 2 things out, you can increase engagement for BME students in the curriculum, which is something which will go some way to addressing the awarding gap. So I read these papers, I saw this work, and I thought, is there something I could do here at the module level? I'm a massive fan of Peter Felton's 4M model: micro, meso, macro, and mega. And I strongly believe the most transformative effect we can have is the micro level, the module level, the session level, and build those up. Okay, so this is the scale as presented by Thomas and Quinlan. The words I'm going to give are my words. They've got really good definitions in their paper, so I'll explain what I meant by these 4 different things. Most of them are fairly obvious. You'll nod your head because you've heard these things before. The real key will come on the next slide, and how we apply those. First one is about diversity present in the curriculum. Remember, when I say curriculum, I'm not just talking about what's on the slides. I'm talking about what I'm saying and my teaching methods. I'm talking about all those things. Diversity is present. Obviously, this is clearly not just imagery and examples. It's about how that diversity is actually presented. So, not just images, of Black people on your slides, but making sure that Black people are shown as scientists, not just participants or research or the general public in whatever context, making sure that equal balance. It's also making sure you represent traditions and cultures and different languages in your curriculum, and that you understand those different traditions, culture, languages, and backgrounds within your curriculum. So that's the one. Second one is positive portrayals. Positive portrayals is more about readdressing the perceptions and that exist in society as a whole, and making sure you don't perpetuate them in a way. I mean, the 2 classic ones would be, when talking about deviant behaviour or criminal behaviour, and the stereotypical image of, someone of a Black background on there. So society perceptions and positive portrayals of all groups. Kind of the other one, which I was definitely guilty of, is white saviour complex. Positive portrayals that white people can solve problems. So one of the changes I made earlier on was a very teeny one. In several of my slides, we had active-based learning activities, and I used to use the phrase, what could we do? Was the kind of opening question. But now the question is, what could be done? As in, we're saying what could we do implies that we have the answers, and what in the context problem that they can do on their own. So a subtle shift. The third one is about challenging power. So this is about raising questions in your class that challenge existing structures. Really important and easy in SciComm in a way is making sure you link the learning to the broader political, economical, social, kind of landscape, which we avoid. Some lecturers avoid, just focus very much on human biology and ignore the big context. And even encourage students to take action when they spot this inequality. That's a very hard one. Maybe I'll take that one last. And the last one is inclusive classroom interactions. In this conference, I'm sure that happens. So this is all down to incredibly micro stuff, like learning students' names and how to pronounce them correctly, all the way up to just making sure you've got an environment where you respect each other's opinions. This is a SciComm module. We talk about things like, vaccine uptake and awareness, an issue that can very quickly turn quite vitriolic if you don't handle it carefully. So I took those 4 things and designed a research project. So the module is called Science Communication, 68 students this year, all biomed, human biology, or zoology, optional module. So what I'm really looking at here is Thomas and Quinlan have already looked at the taught curriculum, and they've looked at the perceived curriculum. I wanted to look at the learned curriculum, what students actually have learned about cultural awareness. And I decided, I've undenied the methodology quite a lot. I decided to focus on effectively the indirect approach. The core question, which I asked every year, is what is science communication? I asked that, they're the first words I open with, and literally the last thing I say on the module every year. It's always been the same. I asked that question this year and did a very simplistic post-it note, flip chart paper cascade, individual responses, then in groups, organise those onto flip charts. And I did that at the beginning and at the end of the module. Obviously looking for cultural awareness themes embedded in there. I was going to do focus groups on it, but I changed the methodology at the last minute and I actually decided to assess the student coursework instead. I would just say that the coursework it's important. So 2 bits of coursework, but the big bit's a portfolio. So each week we do something active learning in class. So there's 8 portfolio options. And the students choose 2 of those only to submit. So they've got a real choice about what they do. In fact, of those 8, 2 of them have got a lot of choice embedded in them. So a lot of choice. And some are very like critical report writing, some are creative museum exhibit design. So a range of kind of skills to develop in there. But I was going to analyse thematically the coursework as well. So that's the approach we took. So what did I actually do? Right, this is the crux of it. Terrible slide. So I basically made my own reflective lens using those 4 pillars that Thomas and Quinlan done onto my delivery. So this looks terrible because it's literally my rough Excel diagram. It's all on paper. I did type one up just for the illustration purposes of what I did. So I decided to break down my slides and materials, my narrative, so what I say. I don't know what you do, but I never write down any script or anything. I never do. But I've taught this module for 10 years, so I knew roughly the direction of where I was going with kind of each kind of emphasis. The in-person activities, what we did in the class, and then everything asynchronous, everything that existed online. And then for each week, I kind of broke down the kind of themes that I was moving through there, and I tried to look through each of those with those 4 lenses and made changes. So that was just week 1's changes in terms of just volume. You see lots of words. And these are some of the things that I changed on the slides. Some of these are incredibly teeny changes. You know, like I present some graphs and I needed to change the samples, what graphs I showed in class. You know, but in terms of what the students see, this is probably a 30-second. Other than one much bigger in terms of the approach that I take. So, like here, in this section here, we talk very much about the general public, and I wanted to move them away from the idea that, first of all, the public's deficit compared to scientists. All students have a perception when they start the module that we know. But I also want to move them away from the idea that the public's a homogeneous group. And throughout the whole module, consider the public as a non-homogeneous group in terms of their responses. And so that's a kind of more robust example. What really surprised me is how many changes I had to make. Some were really quite eye-opening, but I'll tell you some. I don't mind telling you what some I'm quite embarrassed that I've never done it before. Like, so one of the portfolio pieces is to define a science communication strategy. It's a very theoretical type piece. And then in the class, the way that we do it is I've created a fictional town called Hamilton with demographic information. It's not fictional. I use Basingstoke, but I call it Hamilton, so they can't look it up. And we go around actively, we talk about a whole range of kind of theoretical approaches that they can take. And then the portfolio piece is essentially to draft that strategy up. But what I did this year with this lens is I took away in the write-up bit Hamilton and said you can choose any place that you like instead of Hamilton. All you have to do is give me a Wikipedia link to the place, and that allows me to draw on the kind of demographic information I need to assess their kind of strategy. This year, 68 students, I think about 25 students chose that piece, and 15 chose to not do it on Hamilton, even though it was Hamilton class. And won't surprise you, they chose places all across the globe for that example. So one real powerful example for me, how you can diversify the curriculum without actually I can't change such a simple change. And students I really enjoyed marking them. I was learning all sorts of different things. So that's what I did. So in terms of analysis, and I haven't got a slide for this because it's so fresh. So I've done the analysis of the flip chart and post-it notes. And there's really not a great deal of cultural evidence coming to that core module question. There's a little bit, but not much. But where the real power has come from the coursework, I'm shocked to my core how much cultural information is being drawn through in the answers to the coursework. So I've already given you the Hamilton example. Another piece, I do a session called hashtag David Attenborough, which is a science communication pioneer. Session starts off very light and gentle deliberately. You watch some David Attenborough clips without sound and audio. I make them write their own scripts. So it leads to a discussion about narrative techniques and anthropomorphism and all those kind of ideas. Then we talk about David Attenborough's influence at work. And I said, can you name any other science communication pioneers like that? We have a list on the board. Notice anything about them? Shock and horror, most of them white, most of them male. Well, can we name some female pioneers or some non-white pioneers? A few, but not many. Then we build into the draw a scientist test. And talk about representation, science, etc., etc. But then they have to talk about their own pioneer in their case study. It's one of the most popular portfolio pieces. So first of all, very broadly, a broader range of pioneers were chosen. But what was more interesting to me, and I've never seen this before, most students who chose, particularly they chose a white male pioneer as an example, like Brian Cox, for example, did talk about the privilege that they have for being a male. They talked about the influence of race. People like Jane Goodall, they talked about the gender equality she faced in her early career and the patronising messages that she receives. So they brought in a whole range of really interesting and rich stuff. So we're currently at the stage of thematically trying to analyse that. I mean, 68 students, 2 portfolio pieces, it's an absolute minefield in order what to do. I'm very much viewing this as a pilot study, but I don't care what the result says. I think it's been very powerful and I'm going to be doing it again. You know, I'm going to change my approach. So next steps for me. So I've done the sensible thing. I wrote to Quinlin and Thomas and said, we've been doing this, what do you think? And thankfully they've agreed to come on board on the research project, just adding them to the ethics now so they can help us analyse it. I want to repeat this stage perhaps yet this year with a more robust strategy. And my absolute priority is to turn this into something that looks a bit more useful in terms of I hate the word toolkit, there's so many of them, but a toolkit, something to start, show that I don't know what the answer is. I'm not saying this is a good way, this is one thing that you could try in your own class. Just to finish, I showed this to engineering last year, and a student engineer like that said, I took bridge mechanics, you know, I can't do any of that in my context. I said, well, do you give examples of bridges? Yes. I said, well, instead of giving an example of bridges, ask students to bring in their own example of a bridge. It's such a simple change. Riches your life, because you learn about bridges and things, gives them some personal context, you know, so that's done examples done. So I'll finish there. I'd be interested to know what anybody thinks about the idea.
Thank you, it's really an inspiring way to end. Do we have any questions? Emma.
Okay, I just wanted to comment on three kind of trials of this. And we have tends to be like mixed. Is it possible to some students kind of feedback is I always have too much choice. So I wondered whether you did that.
I've had this choice since the module started. I've never really experienced that. But kind of the difference here perhaps is that wherever the portfolio piece is, it's always started in class. So they've always dipped their toe in the water. We've discussed it. We've done something with it. So there's nothing, you know, blind in terms of the choice. So I never really experienced that. But generally, change at an early stage, you know, students like, we want choice. And you give them the choice, like, where are the walls? You know, what are the parameters. But each portfolio piece has its own assessment rubric and its own structure, and I do little podcasts to support them. So, yeah.
Do you make students aware in any way that you're trying to do this?
No. So ethics, in the ethics, in terms of briefing and those kind of things, I had to ask, I had to submit ethics to say we're asking about what is science communication. I asked for permission to not tell them we're analysing their coursework until after the assessment. Otherwise, they could put those things in there. I mean, one real concern of mine is, I did talk a lot about cultural representation throughout the module. Are they saying it because they've now seen those things themselves, or is an element Ian likes to hear about these things, therefore we're putting more of this in our coursework, which is a concern. But incidentally, I reckon 5 or 6 times after a session, mostly groups of students came to talk to me about something related to this, including one kind of neutral statement and one student who had essentially said, why on earth do we keep talking about race? Did happen to be a white European male. But that student who came and had that conversation with me, which I thought was fairly brave, we did talk for about half an hour, and we didn't agree by the end. But at least they were willing to have that discussion. I still found it a good experience that they were willing to come and talk about it to me, and hopefully I gave them something to think about.